everybody. This is the Green Team Society at the University of Gloucestershire. This is our first podcast. We'd like to introduce our panel today. Our guest speaker today is Adam Hart, Professor Adam Hart at the University of Gloucestershire, and we have Nikita Yearens and Joe Stratter. My name is Yolanda Boyser, and welcome. So today's topic of conversation is trophy hunting and whether it's a sustainable method of conservation. Adam, would you like to take this cue and introduce yourself and why you're here today?
Yes, sure. So trophy hunting is kind of something that I've become, well, involved with is the wrong word, but academically involved with for the last sort of 10 years or so, largely because of stuff that we do in the university. So we take students down to South Africa, which is a centre for the hunting industry in the world, and in order to understand some of the economics and the ecology of places in South Africa, you have to understand something about hunting. So that was kind of one step. Another thing is after the Cecil the Lion killing, which I'm sure we'll come on to at some point, I pitched a programme to Radio 4 about trophy hunting. So that was an opportunity to try and get a more nuanced and subtle kind of message out than was going out at the time. So I got quite heavily involved in some of the arguments and discussions about trophy hunting at that time, and that's kind of continued now. So I'm still quite vocal. Not necessarily, I wouldn't consider myself to be an advocate for trophy hunting. I think if we can find another way, that would be amazing. But I am a defender of its potential purpose and suitability for conservation when it's done correctly. I think we need to be very careful when we call for things like blanket bans, for example. So I'm trying to get people a little bit more involved in some of the subtleties and nuances about it, because it's not straightforward, as we'll doubtlessly find out over the next hour or so.
No, absolutely, and especially when words are thrown around like blood sport or cruel.
We have a lot of problem with language. That's for sure on both sides of the debate. And actually, what you find is that both sides have now become so polarised and so entrenched that it's actually almost impossible for either side to ever see the perspective of the other. So we've ended up with a very toxic debate at the moment, which is led really on one side by people who would make out that trophy hunting is the best thing since sliced bread, the only way to conserve wildlife. I don't understand why everyone's not doing it everywhere. And then on the other side, you've got people that are claiming that it's driving animals to extinction, that it's terrible, that there's never any good for it, and you end up with these two very extreme, entirely incorrect, usually, arguments completely opposing each other. So the middle ground, which is normally where most debates end up, actually is very, very difficult to find in this particular issue.
I feel like it's very easy to stigmatise trophy hunting as well. People think like, it's just some rich guy in a van driving off the antelope, dead, or buffalo, lion, if you will. But I also think it's very easy to jump on the bandwagon of, I don't want to see an animal die. That's a bad thing. I'm going to root for like anti-trophy hunting, which might actually not be beneficial for that population of animals in the long run.
Yeah, absolutely. You're totally right. And the thing is, this is very complicated. So I've been looking at it in some depth since 2012. I've been looking at it in a lot of depth since 2015. I first came across it in 2001. And I was looking at it in some depth from there. So this is a topic that I've been interested in for close on 20 years, and I still feel like I'm scratching at the surface of it. It's an incredibly complicated thing. I'll tell you when I first came across it. So I was, the first time I went to Africa, I went to Malawi and Zimbabwe, and we went to Zambia. We stayed on a friend of mine's family's farm, they called it. And I didn't really understand why they were calling it a farm. I didn't quite get it. We went there and it was just full of animals, and there were antelope everywhere, and the bird life was incredible, and the invertebrates and snakes and fish and stuff. It was an amazing place, and it never really sort of twigged. And after a couple of days, I remember asking the guy that ran it, you're calling it a farm, like where are the fields, like, and the bloke was saying, exactly. And the guy's saying, well, look around you. This is what we farm. All this wildlife. They'd reintroduced most of it. They were actually breeding roam, which are at the time quite a rare form of antelope, or species of antelope. They were breeding these animals, they were looking after the grass, they were doing all kinds of maintenance and management, and they were bringing the numbers up. It used to be a cattle farm, now it's teeming with wildlife. And I still didn't really get it. And I was like, how do you get money? And he said, well, what do you think you're eating? I was like, good point. And then, he said, people come in and they hunt. They pay to come and hunt. They bring the meat. They might take the horns. And I said, what do you mean? And then that's when he was telling me about trophy hunting. And saying, well, we've got big animals here. There's a big kudu here that's going to get hunted. A few days later, I actually shadowed a bow hunt on that kudu. A few days later, the guy was paying a fortune to go and shoot it. It was a big old male, wasn't breeding anymore, wasn't actually in very good condition either. And he paid to shoot it, and he stuffed it up. Actually, he missed. He didn't miss. He gut shot it. He had an amazing bow. You could land arrows on a 10p. I mean, this thing was incredible. It was really, really good. It had range. Exactly, yeah. Big cammed bow, and at the range it was fine. But when we were out in the field, he stuffed it up and ended up shooting it too far back. It took us 8 hours to find the animal. It's still alive. We eventually managed to track it through to the other side of the reserve, and it was euthanized. But that was my first experience of it, and I was
quite a brutal first.
Yeah, it's pretty. I mean, horrified would be the wrong word, but I did not come away with oh my God, this is the best thing I've ever seen. This is an incredible way of conservation. I came away with very mixed feelings about it. I could see the value of it. I could understand it in terms of economics, but I wasn't really getting my head together in terms of the conservation value of it, and I didn't really understand the motivation behind it. It's taken a long time to kind of bring these things together. So what upsets me a little bit is when I see people who've come across this for the first time. This is like me in 2001, but they're not in the area. They've read it on a Facebook post, and within 2 seconds they've made an opinion, and now they're signing petitions to ban something that they have no understanding of. And that is disturbing to me. It could, particularly in the current political environment, public pressure can lead to. We've already seen the Conservative Party talking about wanting to ban imports against scientific advice. These are populist moves which are naive and not informed. However, we have to understand that people are angry, justifiably and understandably, about this activity. They don't fully understand it, but what they do understand about it is that they don't want to see animals being killed. Fair enough.
That's really the bottom line for it, isn't it?
Yeah.
That's all they sort of see.
That's all they see. But it's a valid point, and we can't take away from that. We can't just be wholly pragmatic and say, well, it doesn't matter what you think. This is what's going on. We need to be a little bit more inclusive, I think, in the way that these things are thought about, and accept that for many people this is a very, very difficult thing. But there needs to be a more grown-up conversation about it, rather than just we should hunt it or we should not hunt it, and it's just over here, and each side just throwing eggs at each other. It doesn't get us anywhere.
So could we possibly unpick trophy hunting? What is the ideal scenario? Like, what are the benefits of an ideal scenario, and where do things go wrong?
So your ideal kind of setup here is that trophy hunting is a way of preserving habitat. So you have a large expanse of land, perhaps a big concession in Tanzania, or some of the big community conservancies in Namibia, and we're talking vast areas here. And they're under the sort of control, if you like, and the management control of either a group of individuals or individual person or a company, and they effectively sell the rights to hunt certain animals. It's in the ideal world, it would be well regulated, well monitored, and you would be going out specifically to look for old bulls, generally, so old males who have particularly magnificent horns or whatever you're after, that are no longer breeding. So in most of the dynamics of most of the animals that we're talking about, older males are pushed out of breeding situations. They can hang around in fenced areas and cause all sorts of problems, or they end up moving out into the bush and basically dying. The ideal world of trophy hunting would be that you go and select those individuals, you track them down, they're shot, you eat the meat, you take the horns back, and you've had no effect on the population because that animal has done all the breeding it's going to do, and it's basically just,
And it's been rejected by the pride
or the group or whatever, and this would be the ideal situation. Of course, this is the situation that
and also the person who's selecting this animal is a professional who knows what to look for.
Yeah, and I mean, if you want to go hunting, I think people think that you just get off the plane and grab a gun and go and shoot something. It absolutely isn't the case. By law, you have to be with a professional hunter, the permission of the landowner, you're with trackers. If you've paid properly, which most people do, you end up with all kinds of entourage around you. This is not the proper license, which might be provincial or it might be issued by the country. You'll have a permit for the animal, then you'll have to export the animal. You may have a TOPS permit and threatened protected species license. I mean, this stuff is heavily regulated.
So if it's not, that's poaching at the end of the day.
Exactly. Illegal hunting is poaching. Yeah.
What's the difference between trophy hunting and poaching? Just so we're absolutely crystal clear.
But poaching is illegally killing and removing an animal,
right,
without permission, without regulation, just going into a place and killing it, which happens a huge amount. I mean, that's one of the. Trophy hunting isn't a threat to really any species that we're going to be talking about. Poaching is a huge threat. And it's a threat because it's unregulated and it's just taking out whatever. It's snares. I mean, snares are the biggest killer of wildlife. It's a scourge.
Wow, yeah.
Sorry, and trophy hunting is when the regulations are not met it would then be classed as poaching, potentially.
No, I mean, if you don't have the right permits, you are hunting illegally, and that would be poaching.
So if we go back to the Cecil the lion controversy, in effect, that could possibly be seen as a poaching.
I mean, you could view it that actually it was a minor permit violation.
Because it was a professional hunter who missed a tag.
No, it was a professional hunter who had permits for the animal, but he didn't have the correct permit to hunt it in the precise location. So it was considered to be a minor permit violation. Everything else was in order.
Okay.
And that's why all of this,
and
all of
is
this
it
stuff.
feasible to say we didn't see the tag?
The collar, no, the collar's fine. In fact, they were encouraging. Cecil the lion was a very interesting story. So the group that collared Cecil, Wild Crew, are some of the key signatories of letters that I've been involved with defending trophy hunting. Many of the lions that were hunted around Wangi were collared lions. It's great. Okay. You know exactly who they are. You know exactly how old they are. Cecil the lion was a very, very good candidate to be hunted. The only issue with it was that it became a big story.
It was a tourist attraction.
It wasn't. I mean, really.
This is what I heard.
The most famous lion. You search Cecil, all those stories illustrated with Cecil the lion. There's like 15 different lions being introduced here. You give an animal a name, suddenly you get a lot of traction for it. No, this was just, it became a media story, and it was pumped. The hype, it was amped up by people who opposed it. They saw an opportunity, and they were right to, because it became a huge story. And the guy's life's ruined, but he was undertaking a perfectly legal activity. And yes, there was a minor permit violation, that is true. And the hunter that he went with, a guy, well, let's not name names, but you can find out who it is, had other issues, including, I believe, the illegal movement of sable into areas and things. So he wasn't necessarily completely legit, but there were lots of issues about that hunt and whatever. But at the end of the day, it wasn't quite how it was portrayed in the media, but it was a very useful story. The fact he was collared was neither here nor there.
Okay. So what blew that story up? Why did it become so big when trophy hunting had been happening for many years before?
Celebrity endorsement.
Angry people on Twitter.
Celebrity endorsement. People like Ellen DeGeneres, Ricky Gervais and things. Everyone jumped on this because it suited their agenda, and that's they have every right to that agenda. But by doing that, they brought this whole activity into the public eye. Nothing wrong with that. They exposed it to a lot of scrutiny, nothing wrong with that, but they also partook, and everyone that was involved with it also got involved with spreading a lot of difficult information, most of which wasn't necessarily true. There was an awful lot of things. Afterwards, it's you can very easily find people now that will say trophy hunting is the main threat to lions in the wild, and that's total nonsense, absolute nonsense.
Well, I think we learned from you how there aren't many lions in the wild anyway, and most lions are in captivity.
Yeah, well, yes, but let's not. That's a different issue as well. Let's get back to of wild lions. Actually, the areas that have increasing lion populations are actually areas which are involved in hunting. But with lions in particular, where we're talking about, so people talk about trophy hunting being a big problem. It isn't. It isn't a problem at all. The biggest problem is retributive poisoning by cattle herders. Mass poisoning of prides, destruction of habitat, human-wildlife conflict. Now, who wants to live with massive predators around? People kill these animals all the time because they're frightened of them. We run out their habitat, we poison their prey, and we remove prey from them. These are the problems.
And they have no incentive to look after the animals, which is the solution that trophy hunting provides, is that they will take care of these animals because they potentially are an income to them.
And this is a difficult thing, right? Because we end up with, in South Africa, they're always saying, it stays, it pays, and it pays, it stays, rather, and it becomes this big kind of mantra, and it makes a lot of sense. It gives the habitat value that's greater than the value that it would have if it was, for example, agricultural or infrastructure. And the problem that I think a lot of people, me included, really have is that, should it come down to the financial value of that landscape? Should we not find a way that values the landscape for its biodiversity without putting a figure on it? And of course the answer is yes, but down here in the real world, right now, there are, week before, 2,700 square miles of Tanzania was taken off hunting concessions and given over to development. We'll never get that land back for wildlife. Right? All the time we are eroding wildlife land away, piecemeal, gradually. Areas where that habitat is protected by people exercising hunting rights or doing this type of management, whether we like it or not, at least that landscape and habitat is there for wildlife. If we don't like the fact that wildlife is being hunted on there, great, it is a bizarre thing, right? We can start from scratch and go, I know how we can preserve the world, right? We wouldn't do that. we would fund it properly and make sure that that wildlife and those habitats were looked after. That's the point that we need to get to. But in the short term, hunting is providing that financial incentive to protect habitat.
Yeah, I think at the moment
And
it's
that's
like
the
double the land area compared to like just national parks.
Oh, it's a lot more than that. Yeah, a lot more than that. 1.3 million square miles across southern Africa. In South Africa alone, it's 3 times the landmass of national parks.
So you go to a national park and you're like, this is so vast.
Yes, it's a huge amount of land. Namibia, vast tracts. Mozambique, we're talking about Zimbabwe, Zambia, South Africa, and other areas outside of Africa too, and other populations. So it is a big amount of land. And I would say that yes, if it makes you feel uncomfortable or repulsed or whatever, disgusted, right? Fair enough, but we don't throw the baby out with the bathwater.
You don't take it away.
We must have plan B, right? Because that land, if we just say you can't hunt anymore, I mean, first of all, who the hell are we to say that anyway? Right? We're going to stride into Namibia and tell them how to manage their wildlife. They're doing very well. We're not.
Where's our wildlife?
The State of the Nature report shows that we really don't have a leg to stand on when it comes to preaching about wildlife conservation. So we go down to countries that are doing it very well and tell them they can't do it, and they'll say, well, stuff you. We're going to do what we want. We say, well, we won't allow any trophies to be imported, and we'll put sanctions on it, whatever we want to do. And eventually, they can't do that anymore. Okay, where are they going to get the money to protect those lands? They're not, unless we provide it. And then suddenly we turn them from using their natural resources in a sustainable way and an increasing way. Suddenly they're reliant on handouts from other countries to look after their wildlife, and that's got a and that's not sustainable either, because that's a demeaning way to go about doing things. And so when people are calling for a ban, I don't think they've really thought through all this stuff. I mean, maybe they have. But I haven't seen evidence of that. What I see is a lot of emotive photographs of, generally gurning idiots standing over wildlife that offend me as well, right? I'm offended by those pictures. But that's not enough. It's not enough to say, look at this, we don't like it.
Do you think the crux is this whole animal welfare? Because as a nation, we are incredibly caring, mostly for our domestic pets at home. It doesn't seem to extend any further from that.
Well, I guess cruelty-free products and things like that as well.
Yeah.
Do you think there's an element of that they say, oh, that's cruel? How dare you?
Yes, I think the animal rights sort of
tuck into my steak.
The conflation, if you like, of animal rights with conservation is a problem. But equally, there's no harm in thinking about the animal rights issues when you're thinking about conservation. But what you can't do is let one rule the other. And you can't conflate those two issues. For me, a bigger issue is the preservation of habitat and the conservation of numbers, not the preservation of individual animals. And if you can get money, I mean, let's look at what happened in South Africa last week. A black rhino was put on auction for trophy. I don't know what it went for. It went for a lot because they don't come up very often. That was an old animal that was no longer breeding and had already injured, I believe, 2 cows in their breeding herd and was fighting with other males. Right, so that animal is a problem animal. Right? And it needs to be removed. It's a fenced reserve. It needs to be taken out. And so they could sell it to another reserve, but who wants an old black rhino with a history of being, whose breeding herd is going to take that on board? No one. So someone's either going to buy it to hunt it, or they can put it on trophy themselves. So they did. They got the necessary permits. Not easy to do. Very few of them are granted. They sold it. It was auctioned. It was auctioned for hunting. I don't know what it went for. But the one in Namibia not that long ago went for $350 million. I heard rumours that bids before the auction were approaching $1 million. And, that animal will be hunted. That money will pay for the anti-poaching for that reserve for the near future, and a conceivable future, actually. I can think of reserves in South Africa with rhino that would use that money to make sure that the rhino on their reserve was never under any poaching threat for 20, 30 years. And I think people don't get that. People think that somehow all this stuff happens for free. No, it doesn't. Right? If you've got fences, if you fence an area off, like for example in South Africa, or indeed in other areas now in Africa, fencing is increasingly there. Once you do that, you must manage what's inside it, because it won't manage itself. People say, "Oh, nature will find a balance."
A natural environment in itself.
You have to do management, and if you've got animals in there which people want to hunt illegally, people want to poach rhino for their horn or elephants for their ivory or bushmeat, you need to look after it, and it costs a fortune. Vehicles, fuel, people, salaries, fence repairs, getting your roads graded every 6 months, building drainage ditches, supplying accommodation for people that live there and stay there. If you want to have tourists in, you need some infrastructure. If you want to have hunters in, you've got to pay for professional hunters and all that stuff. I mean, this stuff is just ballooning wildlife in beautiful, pristine areas, great, although it's being hammered. Right? But actually, most of these places, even in these bigger areas and sort of wilderness areas, they still need protecting, it still need managing, and it costs.
So where do things go wrong? Because that sounds great, and you think...
it does, doesn't it? Yeah, but it goes wrong. Well, first of all, it goes wrong if you take too many out, and undoubtedly excess...
management of it.
Yeah, I mean, if we look back through history, people will say, well, white rhino are an absolute conservation success story, and they're right? Their numbers went down to virtually nothing, like hundreds or something, back in the 60s, and now there's 20,000, and even though they're being poached, they're still, that's still a success story. And part of that build-up was because people were allowed to hunt them and have them on their land, and they were encouraged to, and they could make money from them, right? But why were they reduced to that number in the first place? Because they got absolutely hammered by hunting. So that was a big problem. Certainly the hunting of the, ivory hunting during the sort of 18 and 1900s, legal hunting, not illegal. I mean, at the time, people could apply for a permit. The Kenya, early Kenyan wildlife kind of ranges was supported by that. People like George Adamson was selling ivory. I mean, it was how people got money. It was the resource they had. But of course, they ended up getting hammered, so that was another problem. That wasn't always trophy hunting, of course, but it's part of the mix. Lions in Tanzania have been probably damaged. The populations there have been damaged by overhunting. So where it goes wrong is if you're not exploiting that resource, if you want to use that language sustainably. That's a big problem, but it doesn't need to be, because we can do it sustainably. And it isn't a problem in some places. It becomes a problem when people don't follow the regulations and don't get the right permitting. And when that happens, people should get hammered for it, and they should be punished to the full extent of the law to encourage it. Blind eyes shouldn't be turned. Slaps on wrist shouldn't be given when there's more appropriate sanctions. Those things need to be properly followed through. It can go wrong if you've got people on the ground that don't know what they're doing. So people select the wrong animal to shoot. People do it badly. Professional hunters can't follow up properly, so they don't find animals that they've injured because it doesn't always go the way it should. Things happen, right? So that can go wrong. It can go wrong when money that is brought in does not then get used for conservation, where it just lines someone's pocket. It can go wrong when that money ends up being taken out of the country because it's most of it. You go and spend $9,000 or whatever on a buffalo hunt or something, and 8,500 of it goes into your outfitter's pocket, based in the States or in Europe. That's not trickle-down economics. That's just exploitative, right?
For the local community.
Yeah, that's just total exploitation. It can go wrong when the money is given into, as happens in Zimbabwe recently, when money is given into central reserves, part of the campfire program and things, but then isn't given out properly to local people. They're now suing the government for that. So these things don't always run smoothly, but we're talking about quite a diverse range of activities across a huge range of different countries and places. Of course stuff's going to go wrong, right? Nothing ever runs smoothly. We need to find ways, if this is to continue, the industry, as an umbrella term, needs to find ways to tighten up. It needs to be more transparent, it needs to have better regulations, it needs to show that it's got regulations, and they need to follow them and they need to do it better. But I think fundamental to that, there needs to be much more transparency about where the money goes. Where is that money? Because at the moment you see this figure, 3% goes down, it's nothing. Right? That figure was based on one place in Tanzania in 2008. It was not even relevant there now. In Namibia it's 100%, in other areas it's different percentages. We need to find out, we need that transparency. If trophy hunting is to justify its existence, it needs to be, we need to know, right? Okay, what animals are here now, what habitat is saved now that wouldn't be saved without it? We need a much more kind of nuanced thing than people just going, well, it's brilliant, it's saved all this habitat. Okay, how much?
It's the biggest argument for conservation, because obviously the economic value and things like that. I checked out the IUCN and they say that actually, Africans would make more money from farming and agricultural land use rather than conservation. So does the argument then need to be more steered towards conservation? Because trophy hunting for conservation doesn't sound right, does it?
Yeah, no, it doesn't. And you're right. The biggest problem is agricultural encroachment. I mean, Kenya banned all hunting in the late 70s. Wildlife on your land, you no longer were able to make use of it. And as a consequence of that and other things, including population increase, Kenya's seen a 70% decline in wildlife. Wildlife is basically going to end up inside national parks. Is that the way that we want to go? And you look at, I do this occasionally, you go onto Google Earth and you look at parts of Africa and you think, oh, it looks like a wilderness. and you zoom in, it's not a wilderness, there's towns, there's roads. You know, humans have been in Africa for thousands of years.
Lucky days.
Yeah, exactly. And then you zoom in and you think, oh, well, that looks green. And then you zoom in and you realise it's fields, right? It's agriculture. People need to eat. And you're right, the danger is if that land is more valuable, if we get into an economic argument, a pure economic argument, if that land is more valuable for this than that, it's going to end up as this. What we want is to strike a balance where the natural world is preserved and biodiversity is preserved and habitat's preserved, and people have enough space to eat, and people have prosperity and energy. You know, people around the world want exactly the same thing, right? They want to be able to bring up their family in a safe environment. They want a higher quality of life. They want to have mobile phones in their pockets, and they want to be able to turn on the lights at night, and they want to be able to get around. It's the same, you know. Just because I think we tend to have this rather warped view of the rest of the world and think that people are happy with, you know, a very low quality of life, and they're not. And everyone strives towards better, and they're getting it. But people get, I mean, we got it here.
I think we just need to.
We chop down all our trees.
Keep on working on what is better, because we haven't quite got there.
We have a slightly warped view about what we're aiming at, and often what we aim at is an unsustainable, resource-hungry, planet-destroying sort of beauty. And that's wrong, right?
But at the cost of everything.
Yeah.
Can we talk a bit about the importance of preserving biodiversity for everybody?
Yeah.
So it's not just a case of, oh, well, just take whatever land you want to and live there and live happily. There is a real need to preserve our biodiversity on our whole planet for all of us, no matter where you live.
Yes.
And habitat loss is a huge problem that is not talked about as much as climate change is. And climate change is a big kind of trend word right now, but habitat loss due to that is probably...
Habitat loss is the single biggest problem, and you go onto IUCN, for instance, their big database, and you look through any species you want, pretty much, and in those conservation threats will be habitat loss. You know, we are expanding in terms of our population, although that's slowing down, but we're expanding still in certain areas, including, for example, part of Africa. We need more land, we need to feed people, we want infrastructure, and we are eroding that habitat. And that is a massive concern, because as we do that, we end up with biodiversity loss, but we also end up with sort of biodiversity simplification. So we end up with, you know, those community structures and those ecosystems becoming simplified, you know, becoming less rich.
Deleterious genetic effect.
Yeah, we can end up with all kinds of issues that
the biggest rhinos get hunted, they're obviously going to become smaller through.
Well, that's okay. So that's an issue related to the genetic problems of selective harvesting, as we might call it, or in this case, we're talking about removing certain trophy animals. That is a problem if you're not regulating it properly.
Yeah, exactly.
If you remove animals after they've bred, it's not a problem. So it's one of those kind of things where, in this lovely ideal world where everything's managed beautifully, okay, that's maybe that shouldn't be a problem, but of course it could be a problem if you're not doing it properly. But yeah, the overall loss of habitat is the biggest thing that we should be concerned about.
So if the advocates of banning trophy hunting really need to think clearly and very carefully about that, if you remove that, now all of a sudden you have a snowball effect of biodiversity loss on a much larger scale.
Potentially,
because there's no investment of those stakeholders to look after those animals.
Potentially, and the biggest problem there is as well is that it won't be overnight. So let's imagine. I mean, first of all, I'm not sure that a ban is really, realistically something that could be effected actually over the next few years. But let's imagine that it was. You wouldn't suddenly the next day see all these things, and actually what would happen is let's say it got banned, people that were calling for a ban would look the next year and go, look, all this wildlife's still here. But in 20, 30 years' time, will it still be there? But equally, I would say in 20, 30, 40 years' time, will there still be a market of people that want to spend a load of money to go to places and hunt animals? Very possibly not. So is that in itself a sustainable long-term thing? Probably not. And I mean, I was a signatory of a letter that came out in Science a few weeks ago, where we basically say that the campaigns to ban trophy hunting are imperiling biodiversity. Not because we support or advocate the use of trophy hunting as a conservation tool, and many of us find it kind of distasteful. I think repellent or repugnant was used in the letter. The problem is if we ban it exactly as we said earlier, and exactly as you're saying now, if we ban it now, what is in place to protect that land? And unless we have Plan B in place, we need to be careful. Yeah, Plan A, trophy hunting, is kind of a bizarre thing, right? And it's difficult for a lot of people to get their head around. But it is, however, it can and is working in some places to preserve that habitat. That's what we need to be careful of. We need to be careful that we don't lose sight of that, and in our haste, to ban things that we don't approve of, that we don't end up with a problem, a much bigger problem. And it's generally a rule in ecology and conservation, and indeed most human endeavours, that simple solutions to complex problems cause big issues.
I mean, even with conservation and ecotourism, culling populations is sort of intrinsically linked to conservation. But you have to take out a certain number of, say, so many males every year because they're going to fight.
It can depend on the land you're dealing with. You're right, though. So, I mean, and let's go back and revisit ecotourism in a minute as well. But it depends on the land. So let's say that you have an unfenced natural area, then nature will find a balance. Actually, you shouldn't really need to cull, because there'll be predators doing that job for you.
If there is any
predators. But this is the problem. Even in those open areas, many predators may have been removed from the system because of our activities.
Or if there's too many predators.
Or there's too many, because they've had a glut and whatever, then that's a problem. If you've fenced an area, even if it's an area, I mean, we talk about fenced reserves, but you might be talking about areas that are the size of counties. We're talking vast tracts of land sometimes. You still have an issue that wildlife within those areas cannot move openly around the landscape. And in that case, you have to exercise some sort of balance, or nature will find a balance, but that balance won't be where we want it to be. It will be
they die out.
Yeah, they'll die out. There'll be a degraded habitat. We'll end up with not what we want. So in those cases, then yes, some form of management tool is necessary. It doesn't have to result in the death of the animal. So you can do live sales. So people will get helicopters in, and you build these big bomas, basically, and curtains in the bush, and you funnel them down. A huge thing to do. Quite stressful for the animals, but you can get them in the back of a truck and take them to auction.
Really less stressful than dying.
Death is instant, right? That's a long-term stress.
That's how good you are.
In terms of stress, probably a lot more. But they go onto the trucks, and you can go and auction them or whatever. And there are game auctions in South Africa where you can go and buy these things and rearrange them. But of course, you're relying on selling them to someone who doesn't have the same problem you have, because they're probably trying to sell them too. So then you think, well, what's a better way for me to do this? I can kill them for meat. And so, you might shoot them for a butchery. But then you think, well, hang on a minute, I'm going to take out this many animals. All this is very scientific, by the way. These management things, it's not just like, oh, hang on a minute, like you do massive vegetation surveys, you get ecologists in, you know what the carrying capacity of your land is, you know exactly what your game count is, more or less. It's quite tricky to count some of these things, but you know what they are. You can convert the animals you've got to their sort of the units of vegetation that they need and stuff. This is not guesswork, right? It's very, very. These people know what they're doing. It's their business, right? They know what they're doing, and so you end up with a certain surplus. Well, maybe you decide to kill them for meat, but you're looking around and thinking, well, I'm going to take those out. Here's an old, let's say an impala or something, the most majestic horns, and he's not breeding anymore, and he's old, and you think, well, I can shoot him and get X amount of money for meat, or I can get someone to come in, they'll pay a fortune to stay here. We'll ply them with beers of an evening, and then he'll shoot it, and then we'll get the taxidermy fee, a trophy fee, and you get more money. It makes no sense whatsoever in that situation not to do that.
Exactly.
And I would argue that it's actually almost irresponsible not to do that. If that money can be used in ways to make that better and make that business run better, make that environment, that habitat run better, it's irresponsible not to. The problem then becomes, of course, when you're not dealing with a small fenced area, you're dealing with a very large ranging area, and then you've got lots of different people interested in things, and maybe people aren't being so selective about what they're doing, and maybe they're hunting things without permits, or maybe they're over-hunting certain species. But all of those things can be, and are, in lots of areas, controlled. But that's not to say that sometimes it doesn't go wrong. Of course it does. But yeah, it's a tricky one.
So in terms of regulation, who should be in charge of making the rules? Is it is it us in terms of the Western world, or are we talking about more local? What kind of support mechanisms do they have? Like, how come you're involved? You live in the UK, but you're heavily involved in this over there.
I think
in terms of if it spans lots of different stakeholders, how involved are the government? Who pays at the end of the day, and who regulates?
Depends where you are. Obviously, there's some form of international regulation in terms of the exploitation of certain species. So CITES, for example, have oversight of some of those things. Although the removal of animals for personal use, so trophies, are exempted actually from most of those things. So that can become quite problematic, but that's largely because it reflects the fact that trophy hunting is not a major issue. Illegal wildlife trade, it's not, Hank from Texas bringing back his kudu head, which are, by the way, not endangered in any way. That's not the issue. It's other forms of mass trade, like pangolins and illegal poaching of rhino horn and stuff. So that's an issue, but there is some international oversight for that. But within the country, it's just the same as here. I mean, the government are in charge and should be, and they'll have a wildlife, department or a Ministry of Environment or whatever, and they will set the rules under guidance from panels and committees, just like here. And permits will be issued, and there'll be a permitting office, and there'll be all kinds of regulations and hoops to jump through, which are getting more and more onerous actually in South Africa certainly, and more difficult. And permits and things, and all of those sorts of things will be in the wash. And then when people come down, there are also regulations to ensure that they pay on the ground. So people will be basically obliged to have taxidermy fees, they'll need to pay for packaging fees, they'll need to have, in certain areas I believe, a minimum number of trackers involved with them, and the minimum number of days on the ground. So all of these things make sure that the money is flowing in. So when people sort of say it needs to be more tightly regulated, there's a sense that it's not regulated. It is regulated, but there may be ways to make it regulated in such a way that makes it more palatable perhaps to people that are opposed to it. Okay. But some people are never going to accept this, and there'll be people watching this going, that's a nonsense argument, I'm never going to accept it. And they're never going to accept it because of an emotional attachment to those animals. I get that, right? I do. But unfortunately, I've also spent enough time in those areas to understand that emotion is not going to save any animals on the ground.
Bunny huggers.
Well, people would call them bunny huggers, and I sort of object to that actually. I don't see any reason for either side to vilify each other because they both have very valid points. The problem is they've got very valid points on different angles of the same story. And people that are opposed to it are really expressing that, that emotional attachment towards wildlife and animals that I think many people that do trophy hunting and that have it on their land and so on also have. It's just they see a different side of it, which is the conservation, the ecological, the habitat side of it. But it's very, very difficult. And I think you're never going to persuade some people that it's a bad thing. You're never going to persuade some people that it's a good thing. But I would just say to everyone, don't just read something and think, oh my God, that's awful. Take some time to really dig down, because this is not an easy.
Inform yourself.
Yeah. I mean, it's quite hard actually. I tried looking online at the economic value of trophy hunting, and I had one person saying 426 million per annum, 132 million per annum, employment rates, and it depends who you're looking at and whose argument. And this is
why we need better information. Yeah, you were saying earlier about I was saying about how this needs to be more transparent. It's exactly that, isn't it? You try and chase these numbers, it's like trying to nail smoke down after a while. And you can't believe anyone.
No.
Because most of the information that's put out, there are some scientific papers, although there's not so many, they're harder to find. Most of the easy to find information is either put out by newspapers, who are very often, when you root down, basically quoting people from very, very one-sided views. So certain charities are fundamentally opposed to the utilisation of wildlife and hunting. They're
the most interesting ones.
We cannot.
Not someone who's like.
Yeah, exactly, and they have a certain aura about them, right? They have that kind of halo effect of being a charity. They must be good, but actually they are biased in what they want to put across.
I won't name the charity, but one was quoting a paper from Southwick 2015, but failed to recognise that his estimates, which were larger than theirs, were international, whereas theirs were African. But I didn't realise that until I found another link to try and find their information source. Yeah. So you can't. Who do you trust?
You cannot believe either side of this, right? You can't, because people that are fundamentally opposed to it, they will. Even subconsciously, but most of the time actually I believe quite consciously, will of course cherry pick the stuff that supports what they say. That's what people do when they're an advocate, right? The side that are thinking, like SCI and people like that, Safari Club International, they're representing their members. They want to see it's a good thing, so they're going to cherry pick or misrepresent. Or that's a harsh term. Let's backpedal on that, not misrepresenting. But people present an argument that supports what they want. Yeah. And if you've got two people over here, very, very hard to get.
So do you think we need more of a scientific standpoint? Because obviously in science you're trying to prove something wrong rather than right, I guess.
Yeah, it would be nice. There is already a very good scientific standpoint, but no one's listening to us.
Right.
Because actually the scientific standpoint, there's been a number of quite, like letters. We had an open letter published in a newspaper. We've got this letter in Science and sort of say, we need to be careful with this. There are plenty of articles and papers being written that show the value of it. The IUCN support that. There are balanced things, but of course, as soon as you come out, so I mean, I've had people say to me, "Oh, you must be being paid by the hunting industry," and I think, why? I'm trying to explain to people, but it's more complicated. And then I get people who are, banging into all this stuff, writing to me and complaining that, "Oh, you're on the side of those bunny huggers. What are you doing? I thought you were on our side." It's like, well, hang on, I'm on the side of habitat preservation.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes I think you've got a good point. Sometimes I think, they've got a good point. So we have to try and be balanced, but it's very difficult because it's quite an emotional thing for a lot of people, particularly in this country, because we don't really have much of a hunting culture. Most people have no real idea of the situation outside of Britain, because when you go on holiday, you're not exposed to this. People, I've sat in South Africa. Yeah, I've sat in a nice lodge in South Africa on an estate, on a range, reserve that I know does hunting, and there'll be two people in there that they were very well-to-do English people talking about all this stuff and how disgusting it all was. And I was just sitting there thinking, God, you don't have the first understanding of the landscape around you. And that is disappointing, right? Because you're well-heeled, well-educated people. I can tell from the way they're talking. They're not stupid, and they haven't got the first idea of the history of the land or the way it's managed. That's one thing. And they're going on and on about it and how terrible it was and how awful that anyone would hunt and blah blah. And then one of them comes over to order, and we'll have the Hemsbock steak and they'll have the impala. And I'm thinking, God, you fools, right? Right? You're and they're really, but it's not right. What they're not doing is putting the things together.
Yeah.
Right? They're seeing one side of it, and then they're not putting that together with the other side. That's one of the problems. It's quite a tricky thing, because you need to join stuff up in the background and have a bit of curation of these ideas, and a lot of people don't have that. So I don't blame them, because they've gone to that reserve, they've gone to that lodge. The people at the lodge don't want to air their dirty washing. They know that Western people don't like the idea that they're shooting animals from the table, so they don't tell them. And they don't take them near the fence. And they skirt the bit where they're doing some burning, and they make sure that the horns are going when they shoot the dinner, right? They don't show them this stuff because they think people aren't interested. But my experience is when you take people to these areas and you start talking about this, they're actually like, oh, and they're really engaged with it, and they're really interested. Yeah. And they're not, they're not going to suddenly go, oh, I'm going to go and shoot my dinner, right? But they suddenly have an understanding. And if they're against this, you say, well, okay, what would you prefer? Do you want to eat beef? And they go, oh, yeah. Okay, let's convert all this lovely habitat and put cattle on there. Of course, the stocking density will be pathetically low because they're not very well adapted, unlike antelope. But we can do that, and then you'll see the kind of wheels turning, and they're like, oh yes,
But surely there's not that much vegetation in some places as well, so you can't necessarily have grazers.
Well, you can have goats very, very thinly spread out, and they turn that area into a desert. Right. So but once people are in these environments and are able to put these arguments together, it's amazing how. Well, I mean, you've been down there, Joe.
Yeah, definitely.
Right, it's amazing how being there and actually talking to people and seeing it in front of you suddenly think, okay, this makes sense now.
It's such being there just sort of makes you click emotionally with the people who are actually on the front line of conservation. Yeah. It's almost like a war they're fighting against poaching
and these are the people
charities as well that are bearing down on them, opposing them when they're just trying to do good.
Yeah, these are the people. I mean, people that are being vilified and called murdering, sadistic, psycho fucks and all this stuff, right? You see this, and then you go and meet these people, and they're giving up every hour of their life. They're barely sleeping for months on end to keep the wildlife safe, to manage that reserve, to do stuff, and they need some money. And so, they use the resources they have.
They have so much more love for the world, for that habitat than anyone in the West.
Of course, I've also met and heard of people that don't have so much of that and do view it more from an economic perspective. And some hunters who maybe aren't as ethical and things, right? So there is that, but most of the people I've met, they are not the people that people think they are. They're just pragmatic, knowledgeable, experienced, dedicated people that are doing a great job conserving the areas they're in, and that's what's lost in all this, I think.
So for Plan B, whose responsibility? Because if we are going across that line, let's hypothetically speak that say that it does get banned in Africa in 20 to 30 years. Obviously, those species could risk extinction. Well,
maybe even trouble.
So whose responsibility is it to come up with a Plan B? Do you think?
Well, okay.
What are the options for Plan B?
Well, this is it, isn't it? Right. So fundamentally, this is going to come down to money.
Mm-hmm.
Right. That's the fundamental fact. Resource in some way, right? not necessarily physical cash, but some sort of development
incentive.
resource, right? Yeah. So first of all, I think it's fair to say that most people regard the wildlife we're talking about, the African fauna, as our international heritage, right? I mean, I can show my 3-year-old a picture of a lion and she knows what it is, right? Show them a magpie, not so sure, right?
Yeah.
We know what giraffes are from the age of 2. These are internationally, we consider them to be our heritage. So fundamentally, if we want to preserve them long term, we're going to have to pay. It must come internationally because the resources in the countries where they are those animals, and we're telling them that they can't use those animals. Or we'll say, oh, you can use them for ecotourism, which has all of its own problems and is nowhere near a solution, and certainly isn't a practical solution for most of the places we're talking about. So if we're telling them they can't make use of the resources they've got, but we need to preserve that land, which is the secondary resource. Okay, we can't use the animals, we'll use the land for something else. We all know you can't do that either. We are going to have to provide them with something. So fundamentally, it's going to come down to international money, but not as aid money, not as
Custodian money?
yeah, not as like begging bowl money. It's such a humiliating way to we'll
We
give
pay
you
them as like
our
not
largesse.
tenants, but as a
Yeah, well, land leasing,
Yeah.
basically, right? If we want that land for wildlife and you own that land, then we should pay for it, right?
yeah.
Absolutely.
So we
The
should lease it
warden
from
of
them.
that, the custodian of that
Yeah.
land.
And these people, by the way, know more about managing that land because they've been managing it for thousands of years, right? I think we've got this idea that Africa is somehow this beautiful, unspoilt wilderness, and then humans arrived sort of 200 years ago. It's a total nonsense. African empires have built and fallen when we were still around here, barely working out what we were doing. This is a sophisticated area that knows how to manage that land and how to live in some sort of balance, and has been doing. Things are going wrong because
It's outside influence.
outside influence, right? So,
But
which is
also
now what we're talking
humans-
about, more outside.
Humans
Yeah.
fundamentally are flawed. So,
Yeah, and we're much more numerous now as well. So, this sort of notion that we set up reserves and exclude people, fortress conservation model.
Yeah.
I mean, we'll look into some of the problems that the World Wildlife Fund are having at the moment. I'm using the word problem as a euphemism for allegations of murder and torture. It's disgraceful, some of the things that are being alleged that are going on, and it's all to do with this sort of fortress style of like excluding people and so it's effectively like barriering up the natural world, and we can't have any place in it. Actually, no, we can have a place in it, and we can all live together, but we need to be able to find money for people to do it. So fundamentally, I guess Plan B has to involve international, not aid, a different style, a different committed. We're not talking about 10 years. I mean, I'm talking about a 100-year commitment to providing the finance to land lease and then developmental money to do it in a way that can be done properly.
that can be laid out to places like the Amazon, which are our lungs
Yeah.
of our planet.
Yeah, exactly. We need to look at this in a much more joined up way.
Because we have the same attitude towards people in the Amazon
Yeah.
and in Brazil.
Yeah,
and
we do.
in
And the
South
Brazilian
America
government have
in
done
terms of-
some shocking things.
yeah.
And again, shocking things is a euphemism for killing people. I mean, this is what's going on, and the rights of indigenous people are rode over very, very roughly, and we're in danger of getting into that side of things if we start sort of dictating how countries do things. But of course, the flip side is that trophy hunting, for example, is a very recent thing. It wasn't the way that people were managing that land before. So that, in a sense, is a form of colonial kind of dabbling too. None of this is perfect. It's all difficult. But fundamentally, we do need to find something better. And we need to find something that's sustainable in the long term, because if people are going to put all their eggs into that basket of, ecotourism, for instance, which we've touched on a few times now, very, very vulnerable to political pressure. And some of these countries, I mean, let's be honest, who's booking trips to Mozambique right now? No.
I was going to go in December.
And I would love to go.
Beautiful
but
country.
this is not a
Beautiful.
common tourist destination,
No,
right?
absolutely.
Zimbabwe, hardly an attractive list of most people's kind of place to go. There are certain places, honeypots, which people will go to, but generally speaking, most of that area is
everyone
not.
goes to Victoria.
Yeah, and as
And
soon as there's any political problems, you can guarantee that country is gone
Yeah.
from the political map.
But I guess from an ecotourism, like the volume of it as well, I guess for trophy hunting, it involves less travelling, less
Yes.
people, so actually that's a positive there as well, isn't
Way
there,
less
for
Yeah.
climate, but also things like alien species, transporting
yeah.
people.
Yeah, I mean, ecotourism is a blight on the landscape quite
Yeah.
frequently. All the problems of trickle-down economics apply just as much to ecotourism. A lot of the jobs and employment involved in ecotourism are actually, oh great, you're bringing employment, to people. For example, when they stopped hunting in Botswana, people that were highly skilled trackers and have spent all their life in the bush and can tell you what they can track an ant across a tennis court, are suddenly being told, oh, we'll give you a job, you can come and clean this hotel room.
Clean these pots.
Like Jesus, that's what sort of
wasted potential.
Oh yeah, and not only that, what sort of development is that? It's pretty disgusting. And meanwhile, you've got these sort of, many of these places are running at less than half capacity anyway. It's not. Let's be honest. It's not like people don't go to Africa on holiday because there isn't the opportunity. There's plenty of opportunity. We don't necessarily need more development in that respect because it's not very sustainable. It's really not, because any little glitch or any change in exchange rate, suddenly people go somewhere else. Or they go en masse, or there's maybe there's an atrocity, or some awful natural weather event, or some political instability. Well, that's that goodbye. That's not going to happen again. All of these things really.
Yeah.
That's not a great investment either. But it can and does work very, very well in certain places, right? There's no doubt about that. So yeah, I think fundamentally Plan B has to be much more thought through and international. But fundamentally, it's all going to come down to money.
Yeah. But I suppose the bottom line is at the moment, habitat loss is the biggest issue.
Yes.
And trophy hunting maintains the habitat in the best possible way at the moment.
It can and does, but sometimes there are issues. But overall, it's doing an all right job. Yeah. But we need Plan B. Certainly in 100 years' time. It would be depressing, wouldn't it, in 100 years' time we was having the same conversation and it hadn't really gone anywhere. But it wouldn't be depressing if we were at least arguing about the same bits of land. Right? That would at least be good.
We probably need to start wrapping up. So for the people watching today, in terms of if this has affected them, what is it that they can do? How do we get involved in creating those Plan Bs? How do we start moving towards a longer term sustainable plan?
Well, I think what the first thing we need to do is to get out of this.
of our habitat in general.
We need to stop going down media-driven side issues, which is really what the trophy hunting debate is. It's not this. It is an important issue, and it's clearly an important issue for certain places and for certain species. But really, as we've said, it's not the issue at all. No. We need to focus on the bigger picture here and get that sorted out. So I would say to people not to, just to be a lot more sceptical about what they read from everything. Right? Don't think that just because it's appeared on a celebrity's website or in a particular newspaper, and I won't name names, but there are newspapers in this country that are owned by people who fundamentally oppose this type of activity, and that influences what's reported. Of course it does. Right? It's the way the media works. Right? We shouldn't be surprised. Of course it does.
Wait, the media's biased?
Yeah. Well, people are putting forward stories that mean people might click on it. Yeah, of course. So I think people should try and be more informed. People should realise that there's nothing that's black and white. That everything is shades of grey. It's all more subtle and complex than it is. And I think fundamentally, what can we do? Well, we should take more of an interest in these things, and we should realise that perhaps. Let's start lobbying politicians to do something useful. Yeah.
Do we see that this is a directive that should come from an international body, or is this something that people should be managing on a local level?
I think it would be best if it came internationally, and I think it would be best if it came internationally across, not just from the sort of community outside these areas sort of coming down, but a two-way conversation and associations of countries, and there are already associations of Southern African countries, for example, that have very similar wildlife issues that are starting to sort of move as a more collective, so the SADC countries, SADC countries, that are starting to move towards this type of thing. So I think we're going to see changes and movements in this, and I think people are seeing, if you like, the writing on the wall. We can't ignore the fact that trophy hunting is a despised activity. Regardless of whether people understand it, regardless of where they're coming from, we can't deny the fact that there is a very large level of public disquiet about this in countries where public disquiet can influence politicians. Yeah. So, people need to be looking not just what's going to happen in 5 or 10 years, but how can they keep that habitat secure, into the distant future, and that's not going to come from probably anything we're doing right now. Yeah. All of which are stopgaps, really.
Yeah. Do we need to be more habitat focused rather than species focused?
Yeah, wouldn't that be that? Absolutely.
That would be nice, wouldn't it?
Wouldn't that be great? Because if you look after that, you look after everything within it. And not just species, you know, you ask people to name African wildlife, they'll probably tail off after the first 4 or 5, you know, unless they know about it. But all of this stuff, you know, from the smallest dung beetle to the greatest elephant, you know, that's what we need to do, and you're absolutely right. It's by preserving habitat that we do that, and we do that by accounting for both the habitat and the people. And if we forget, so many conservation arguments and so many models of conservation forget people. You know, humans have to be part of this solution as well. Otherwise it's just not going to work, because we're flawed. You know, but we can play to those strengths and weaknesses, right? We don't have to be constrained by them. We know what our strengths and weaknesses are. Yeah, we can come up with models that work to them.
I think hopefully more and more we are realising that our lives are not just dependent on what happened in our microenvironments, but we are part of the whole ecological system that takes place on our planet, and it's absolutely critical for us here where we live to preserve our Amazon, to preserve our wildlife and habitats, and not just focus on our immediate environment, because that will inevitably lead to our demise if we neglect that.
We're kids in a sweet shop, and we're like 5-year-olds, and we need to be more like grown-ups now. You know, and we've reached the point where we need to mature. We need to understand that we're all in this together, that we're not very good at that, right? We value ourselves above those people that are close to us that we know, and we value that group highly above everyone else. We need to understand that we are all in the same boat ultimately, and we're also very poor at thinking about the future. The next couple of days we can cope with, but once we get beyond a certain point, we actually view future us and versions of future us in the same way that we view other people. It's like the future happens to someone else. We need to understand that it's going to happen to us, and we need to understand that it's going to happen to other people that are just like us. You know, our children and grandchildren, they're going to have the same hopes and dreams and aspirations and the same problems and everything, and we need to grow up. We need to get from beyond the 5-year-old in a sweet shop, and we need to start running the sweet shop better.
Start adulting.
Yes, exactly. It's time. We have to. And you know, people talk about, it's a wake-up call. We've had enough wake-up calls now, right?
Yeah.
We should be awake, right?
It's been a lot of alarms.
Let's get to work.
We keep snoozing the alarm. Like, no,
Right.
right? Snooze it once, okay, twice, yeah, whatever. At some point you have to get up. And that, I think we've surely have reached that point.
Yeah.
Surely.
Adam, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, a pleasure.
From Keats, Joe and I, that we value your time. We hope you've enjoyed. Please put your questions on the comments section wherever you found this, and we'll see you in our next one. Bye.